We're going to start just talking about how we've seen sales training change, and also a little bit of the background with training industry as well, and use that as a backdrop for discussion with the audience. We'll also talk about creating that engaging training experience. So in terms of what can we do to make training even more engaging, especially in this virtual or hybrid world that we're living in today. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about this idea of collaborative learning. So what we call CLX, the collaborative learning experience. And there are certainly learning experience platforms out there. It's kind of an emerging area, but why that produces better outcomes and what we can learn from some of the case studies and examples that we'll share, and then wrap it up with some key takeaways. So just to kick this off, we'd love to get feedback from the group. This is a question we've been asking a lot of our clients, and it's really thinking ahead over the next 6 months or so. What are you thinking? What are you seeing in terms of your organization's planned work environment? So do you see it purely as a remote? They're going to continue to be remote and virtual. Is there some hybrid option? And we're seeing that, I think, where people are coming back a few days a week or planning to come back a few days. Certainly some organizations are saying, no, we're going to be back in the office, whether that's September 1st or at some point, or maybe still figuring it out, right? Kind of waiting and seeing and letting things maybe evolve a little bit over the next few months. But, Norman, it'll be interesting to get the results. We'll keep this open just a few seconds more. I appreciate training industry for opening this up for us. But I'd be curious to see what the audience has to say. What are your guesses?
I think that what I'm guessing will come up the most is probably hybrid. I think that, there's no clear path forward. We thought we're kind of emerging from COVID. I think we are, but, there's obviously in the news a lot about variants. Not all countries are in the same place, let's say, necessarily on a global standard. So we work with a lot of global companies, and just how those countries are emerging from COVID varies from location to location. So I'm expecting that we'll see but I've been surprised on these polls before. I think most importantly, it really impacts how we train in the future. And I think that that's some of the changes during COVID, and we'll talk more about this later, are really, I think, for the better. So obviously the pandemic wasn't for the better, but I think some of the things we learned about how people engage and how they train can really improve training experiences. So I think if we can share the poll results, and yep. I guess I wasn't too far off. I think that's kind of what we're saying in the press. Hybrid is what we're doing at SRG and what we're saying. Ray, any additional thoughts on this?
Well, I think what's a really interesting takeaway from this is 85% of the audience, if I'm looking at this correctly, is saying they'll either continue remote or some remote plus hybrid. So I think that means, virtual in some way is here to stay. And we also need to be probably a little bit more flexible about our delivery methods and how that's going to evolve. And again, that's the next 6 months. Who knows what the year after that? But I think it's certainly consistent with what we're seeing with our clients, which is, yeah, we'd like to do some things in person, but we're not really sure. Or maybe we're going to kick off in person, but boy, we're going to do a lot more, even virtual sales kickoff meetings, that we saw a lot of those this past year, starting things off, SKOs or annual meetings or trade shows that are some combination of remote or blend.
Yeah, so I think that's really interesting because, as you mentioned, SKOs, a number of companies were also using collaborative learning for their SKOs. And I think that's although we're going to apply it more from a training perspective, as we share more about what collaborative learning looks like, if there are virtual SKOs occurring as companies start to launch their years, whenever their fiscal years begin, I think many of the things we're sharing would apply to the annual sales kickoffs as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, from a training delivery standpoint, what's interesting, looking at some of the training industry research here, and Ken Taylor was nice enough to share this with us. This is some updated research the training industry has done, looking at delivery methods as they've evolved over the last, 18 months, 2 years or so. So before COVID, not surprisingly, very large percentage, 40+%, was instructor-led in person. And obviously that shifted dramatically, February, March of 2020. And this is over the past year. What we saw is a much bigger increase in VILT and e-learning. So now representing over 50% of the over 70% of the market as opposed to 50% or of the delivery methods. And there's still some ILT in there. I mean, we know that some people were still making it happen, or maybe they had a few events early or later, but there's still some preference for that. And then other methods in there. I think what's really interesting is if we're looking at this predicted at the end of the year, and this is consistent, I think, with what our audience said about their return to work, is it's going to be a mix. So ILT creeping back up, but not to where it was pre-COVID, and virtual still remaining strong, right? Remaining a larger percentage. And so I think the takeaway message here is, boy, that's actually a pretty even pie now if we look at 26, 36, 33. So, kind of split between some e-learning, but really between VILT and ILT. And as we'll talk about, well, what does that look like when you put those together in a blended or collaborative learning experience?
So just kind of building on the research from training industry, it actually gets to the perceived effectiveness of each of the modality. And I think this was really interesting to me because if we look at the top two, on-the-job training and on-the-job coaching, it really gets to skill application and adoption. People are really looking for a way to take the knowledge they have or the skills they learn, and the best way to do that is on the job. So whether that's working with a mentor, working with a coworker, or maybe getting coaching from your manager, those have the highest level of effectiveness because you're applying and adopting the skill at the same time. ILT continues to pull very well. People have grown up learning in classrooms. One of the things that ILT has a real benefit is you don't have the distractions on VILT. Quite often people can go and start, especially if it's a large group, checking out a little bit, maybe checking their texts or responding to emails. And ILT, much easier to make eye contact and create a level of engagement. If we look at the bottom of the chart, I think when we think about the effectiveness from training, webinars are not very effective. And we saw this ourselves a little bit as we started to first get into the pandemic. Many of our clients are saying, can you run large group sessions? And we wanted to run those sessions. We're also very clear that webinars are much better for sharing information like we're doing now, helping people really think through issues, maybe respond to some issues. But if we're actually going to focus on behavior change, at least VILT, where we went to small groups, and for us, VILT might be a group of under 16 people, can be very effective. The interesting thing that we'll get to later is in collaborative learning, that group size can go way up. So you can actually train at scale with collaborative learning. But it's interesting to me, just kind of the perceived effectiveness or lack of effectiveness of webinars. And we share that. We think it's a great way to share information, but not necessarily to train. I think what it also points out here is that blended learning is going to work best. There's no single bar here that's showing 80% or 90%. So that the idea is, how do we combine these areas so we get a variety of ways to engage, interact, and let people apply and adopt the skills that they're learning? And so we've always been big fans of blended learning. And then, as we'll share with you, we think collaborative learning goes one step further, maybe more than one step further than blended learning, in the way that it actually integrates, as opposed to just having separate components. The components are actually integrated into an overall solution. So really nice. We do want to just shout out again to training industry for providing us with this information and allowing us to share this information. We think it's great research.
Yeah, I think it is great. I think the other thing that's really interesting is, we're certainly aware of the fact that adults have different learning preferences, learning styles. And what's really interesting beyond this, this particular slide, is the fact that, those training programs that individuals rated highest were the ones that really satisfied their own needs, right? That they had a preference for a certain learning style. And if they had that learning style, then they typically felt the program was more successful and it had better outcomes. I think what that means is, it's a little bit of, we've got to fish with the right fly, if that's the right analogy, right? But we've got to have the right method to really tune into and engage that learner. And that may mean using multiple facets, which is the blended learning. If we think about the top 4 or 5 here, if we combine those, we have a really powerful offering.
Absolutely. So I think we have a chat that we'd like to have everyone respond to. So if you haven't already set your chats to all presenters and participants, we'd love you to do that. But if I think about this question, what are the greatest challenges your organization experienced over the past year? And I just think so. Feel free to start, chatting and sharing those in the chat if you would. What I would say is that from our perspective at SRG, almost all of our programs included some instructor-led component. In fact, I recall Ray being in Europe when the pandemic started to hit, and that was probably the last instructor-led training we did for one of our global clients. And we had to adapt very quickly. So like everyone else, we started leveraging Zoom. Later on, we started also leveraging Teams. We started leveraging all the video assets. But for us, it was really, we had to pivot very, very quickly. We're in the training business. But what I'm curious about is just kind of what challenges you saw in your own organizations as you had to adapt to COVID and how you were training your teams.
Yeah, so love to get the responses, just thinking about what that looked like for the participants we have today. And just while you're thinking about that, I know Richard had a question about why the adaptive learning on the previous slide was so low, right? Adaptive learning being a great way to tailor that. And I would say that that's probably more a research artifact that either people didn't know what to think of that, or when they thought about their other top priorities, that was just one that wasn't as high as the others. Not to say it's not equally important, but just didn't rate on the breakout.
Right. So we're seeing in the chat here the change from mostly in-person training to virtual training. I think that was a major shift, especially if you were used to running in-person workshops. Sometimes the materials you're using may have already been designed for virtual. If they weren't designed for virtual, you had to build in a lot of interaction. So someone here is writing Zoom fatigue. I think that we went through a lot of Zoom, and not just all the training was moved to Zoom or a similar platform, but virtually all the meetings, and whether those are internal meetings, customer calls, technical type of calls. So we got really used to Zoom. I think everyone's used now to putting on the camera. A lot of people were a little bit camera shy before. Ray, we're seeing a lot of great responses here. I'll comment on one more, converting ILT to a blended learning approach. So blended learning works best. ILT is great. It's still pulled, I think, number 3 on the bar chart we saw a minute ago. But yeah, making that shift is hard. What else are we seeing here? Lack of skills to, go ahead.
No, I would just echo that I think what we saw a lot of organizations do is just take their ILT and try to use the same slides and the same instructional design and put it on Zoom. And, we even saw organizations trying to do, 4-6 hour virtual training sessions. And boy, talk about, Zoom fatigue versus, rethinking the instructional design, chunking those up into modules where they can do some work in between, and they can also get back to their daily work or have a little time to digest. And we know that adults learn better through spaced learning anyway. So I think that is a real challenge. And then also, as Susan mentioned, having the skills to facilitate virtual, it is different, and it takes a bit to learn how to engage the audience and how to call people out and really get them to lean into the sessions and not multitask, as you said earlier. So I think this is really interesting responses. The other one Charlie mentions is measuring effectiveness, which is always a challenge for training, but especially virtually at the end of the session, did they like it is one thing, but are they actually applying the skills? Are we creating real behavior change? Are we producing business results? And how are we going to measure that?
And we'll probably move on because just in the interest of time, but Susan had another interesting point here that she just mentions, that much better appreciation for instructional design. So that when you, to echo your point, Ray, when you're going to deliver virtually, you really have to think about instructional design. And we ended up running a number of train the trainers for our licensed clients on virtual delivery. Just they had been so set in instructor-led training, their facilitators were uncomfortable. So we actually ended up running some sessions on that. So let's move on in the interest of time, but really appreciate everyone's involvement in the chat, and we will have another opportunity for some more participant engagement as well as questions at the end of the session.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're going to move on and really talk about that training experience. And I think really the instructional design comes right into play there, just as we were talking about. How do we create that engaging experience so that we get the participation, we get the application, and so they take away something positive from that. So Norma, let's talk a little bit about some of the options that we could look at. And, I would even think ILT, VILT, we could probably combine in the middle column, but maybe you could walk us through this chart.
Sure, and I'll just mention that the CLX is, again, our internal naming convention for collaborative learning experience. So you can think of the last column as collaborative learning. But when we think about this is a chart that's updated. E-learning has gotten better over time. Micro learning, I remember when e-learning used to be, 30-minute videos, and people had very, very low completion rates. And what we found out is that people, and I think we all found out together, much better appreciated and valued micro learning, where you did 2 to 5 minute snippets. You can kind of stitch those together in learning tracks. 24/7, so the ability to access anytime. That was really important for a lot of learners. Millennials became very, very comfortable. I think today all of us are comfortable, accessing platforms. VILT and ILT obviously offer the live facilitator. Exercises and assignments are, very much a part of any kind of workshop. The discussions and the peer-to-peer learning. If we go back to the e-learning column, we get the gamification. I remember going several years back, I was a little bit cynical because I'm not a millennial, as you could probably tell, but I actually found that the gamification works with millennials, works across all audiences. It's something we're seeing a high level of engagement around in missions. The ability to customize and when we think and scalability. And so when you think about, it's a little bit like when you go to the auto dealer and they're showing, 3 different models and they're showing, kind of the check marks. We transformed our delivery from being a combination of ILT, VLT, and e-learning into really a collaborative learning experience. And we think that it does a great job of checking all of these boxes because it's combining the best of both, but not simply by saying, hey, we're going to do VILT and then we're going to do e-learning or vice versa. We're going to flip the classroom, but really integrating these into a learning experience. And that's why we landed on the internal name that we've gone to market with, which is collaborative learning experience. We really think it is experiential learning. And Ray can do a really nice job, I think, of breaking that down a little bit more. This is a graphic we often use just to explain the various components, to our clients or to anyone who's interested in learning more about what is it, what does collaborative learning actually look like?
Right. And, I think just to pick up on your comment, Norman, that really CLX, the collaborative learning experience, takes both the e-learning and what's, excuse me, good about virtual and combines it. So we start with micro learning. So that may be videos, online where they can consume the knowledge and the content individually, asynchronously. But then we're bringing that together into some sort of facilitated session to be able to discuss. So we have them go through the program. They're actually then applying those skills. So the skill application through what we call missions and field work. So being able to, maybe it's submit a call plan, or maybe providing a list of common objections, and then really acknowledging and clarifying and thinking about how they're going to respond to those. So they can do those exercises in the platform. And I think what's really valuable is then in the discussion and collaboration, they can see each other's work. They can actually learn from each other, and we can share the best practices that are coming out of those discussions. And those of you who are facilitators, I'm sure you've had that. You get those aha moments in your live sessions where there's real great sharing. There's some huge key takeaways that are being brought to bear. But then they're gone, right? As soon as we walk out of the classroom, it's like, oh, we kind of lose that. Well, here they're captured, and we can go back, we can refer to those. We can have those discussion boards where they're posing questions that are coming up. We had a very large tech client that was really struggling with price commoditization. And so we had a whole discussion going about how people were responding, what they're doing today, what resources they're bringing to bear. And to me, that's learning in the spirit or in the context of real work, and makes it that much more applicable. So we look at the discussion. They have access to all the tools and resources. So again, instead of, hey, here's an email with a bunch of additional resources, or you're trying to find that toolkit, it's all hosted in the same place. It provides that landing. And there are a number of different platforms that support this type of thing. And then the final piece that you mentioned, Norman, was around gamification, and the idea that just a simple ability to track progress. And in this case, we're providing points and badges at incremental points as they go along for completing activities. And boy, I was really surprised and impressed to see just how competitive the teams were to go through those activities to make sure they're on that leaderboard, to make sure they're getting the points that are associated. Versus, sometimes you finish a program, you don't really know if they took anything away or if they're applying it. In this case, it's very measurable. So I'll just pause there. Anything else you'd add, Norman, to this?
I'll add a little bit more later as I just kind of share my personal experience with one of our larger industrial clients. I know you launched this initially with a very large tech client. You were talking about the pricing. I do want to comment though, just briefly about the leaderboard. What I found is that, the participants are very anxious to complete the work. There is that level of competition between them, but it's a friendly competition because everyone can win. It's not like there's only one winner. The goal here is really course completion with everyone earning the badges, and we'll share with you kind of a Credly badge that we issue at the end of the program. But it also creates a high level of visibility to the management and to the program sponsors. And so they're not really wondering if people are kind of tuning in or not tuning in. They can see real time where everyone's at in the program and quickly course correct. So you're not kind of, 6 or 7 weeks into a program and realizing that someone's, trailing behind. It gives really, real-time feedback to the program sponsors and managers and provides an opportunity for course correction early in the process. And I think that's been a major reason we're seeing such high completion rates.
Absolutely, and we'll talk about that a little bit in the story, the case study that we'll share. But just to give a quick example, I mean, one of the things that I think is really valuable is having a very welcoming user interface and a way that they can get in there and they kind of see where everything is. It's very intuitive, so they don't need to be trained on the platform, so to speak. But it's easy to navigate. Everything's there in one place, as we mentioned. And we believe in a process that releases the content over time. So instead of going in and saying, okay, well, here's 6 hours of training, we release it over a series of weeks. And so each week or period of weeks, they have an opportunity to complete those particular lessons, watch those videos and activities, and then get the badge for that particular module and move on to the next. So you see across the top here, we have prospecting, planning the call, developing needs, presenting solutions, et cetera. So those are key modules that they would typically go through in a selling skills program. And those would be released over a period of 6 or 7 weeks in this case. And then for each of those, this is the gaining commitment module, it would break out those orange bars we call accordions, expand and would have a combination of videos. They would have assignments. They would have content tiles that is elaborating on that. So again, they have all of that available at their fingertips. And that's where they would actually do the assignments and apply those to real life accounts, right, that they're working on as they go through the program. So a nice way to kind of lay it out, to navigate and to engage the learning as they go along.
Yeah, Ray, one comment I would add to this, I think has really resulted in the high completion rates is that you mentioned the content is being metered out, whether that's a sales coaching program, a comprehensive selling skills program, a selling to key executives program. So the content might vary, but if you look under where it says gaining commitment, Ray mentioned this is, the release for that. They're getting an email in advance, kind of just sharing with them, here's this week's, a module that we're going to be covering on gaining commitment. But if you look underneath that, it gives you an estimated time and the number of points. So by spacing this out, it's very clear if you release a program like this over a series, let's say of 6 weeks, I think this is a 6-week program, that the time commitment's about 60 minutes. The point total is about 310 points for a program that has roughly 1,800 points. So another benefit here is that we're chunking out the learning and it's becoming very manageable for participants to really understand roughly what type of time commitment is going to take over the next week, and also how many points they would achieve to their point total. So I think that's just another element that we've found to be really beneficial for the learners.
Yeah, and Norman, there are a few chats coming in, and again, really appreciate the engagement and collaboration here, right, among our participants. But as Charlie mentions, metering out the content builds anticipation. Everybody kind of likes that opportunity. Oh, what's coming next? As opposed to, oh my goodness, I have 8 hours or 10 hours of training I have to finish. So I think that's nice. It's also very manageable. It's like, oh, if I keep up, maybe it's 1 or 2 hours a week, but that's a reasonable amount to lean in and engage in that program. and they like that. Christine mentions it's, spaced or drip fed learning, so learning over time. And I think the other thing that's so important here is it allows them to apply it in real time when they go back and go to their day job. So that idea of learning in the flow of work is so important that they can apply this to accounts they're working on and come back and talk to the group, right, when they get that back. So a couple of specific questions. Again, we said we take these as we go along, and we will leave time at the end as well. But Charlie mentions, do we incorporate texting? Text-based learning is popular and effective. I think that's evolving. This particular platform allows for mobile engagement, so they can certainly engage that way. Haven't gone down that path, specifically with text assignments or using that, but they can use their mobile devices as ways to engage, certainly. All right, so let's talk about some of the other programs that we've deployed in this manner and kind of the evolution there, Norman. Maybe you could just talk through how we're deploying some of these programs.
Sure. So
on the
these are just representative SRG offerings. Obviously, we have a whole suite of sales offerings. The newest one being signed to key executives. We have the high impact sales manager offerings, as Ray noted. We have a book on this, kind of a synopsis of the program. The book itself is not training, but it's a nice synopsis of the program. For us, the evolution has been we're, as I said, we're in the training business. Obviously, we're a sales training company, and we had to adapt to the new reality associated with COVID. And basically for us, ILT training had been off the table for over a year. And so, like a lot of like a lot of you and a lot of our clients, we immediately went to VILT, but we also had all the training already, the e-learning, the micro learning assets. And so we had already started some of this work. This wasn't just because of the pandemic, but it really accelerated our work in terms of how do we combine all these assets into collaborative learning. We had a client that wanted to sponsor that work, a large tech client that Ray's done a lot of work with, and it worked really, really well there. And so over time, we've just migrated all the programs to collaborative learning. It's not to say if someone wants traditional instructor-led training, we can do that on any of these programs. Someone wants e-learning, we could do it on these programs. But what we're recommending, at least our lead solution today, is collaborative learning, because we think it creates better outcomes. We'll talk about why it creates better outcomes in the next section. But that's just been our evolution. And we started with kind of our most popular programs, but over time, we've been migrating all of our programs to the collaborative learning experience.
Yeah, it's great. And obviously we'd be happy to talk more about any of these or share some samples of, how those are working. But we've seen some good success. And, I want to make sure we cover a couple of, case studies and then also leave time for some stories and questions at the end. So let's talk about, why collaborative learning does produce better outcomes. But first, again, we'd like to get feedback from the group. Like to understand, what design elements, we've talked about a lot so far, but what design elements are most important for you all as you're considering your future initiatives? And love to hear from the group here, kind of what's hot, what's top of mind. I know there were a number of comments about the spaced learning and pulsing out the content and even, text learning, but what are you all incorporating, whether you're a sales leader or a learning and development or sales enablement professional? What are you seeing as really important to incorporate in your future training?
And I think the key for us is this is an opportunity for us to learn as well. So we, our customers make us smarter by understanding what design elements are important. We're really interested in design elements that you think improve behavior change. That's really what we're focused on, is improving how teams engage with their customers or how managers engage with their teams. So I'm saying quick bites of learning that are accessible. So this idea of not necessarily just kind of drinking from a fire hose, but chunking out the learning and having it in bite-sized pieces. So that makes a lot of sense. Leon, thank you.
Yeah, and I think we did, touch on a number of these as we went along. Oh, that's interesting. Charlie mentions virtual giving access to experts with an industry leader. And, I think that's so important that we can access resources that might have been prohibitive, right? If we have to fly somebody in for a 1-hour keynote and you're paying, thousands or tens of thousands of dollars for that. But if you can get them, on a virtual call or virtual meeting, maybe we can access some of those resources. Same thing with your own leaders within your company. right, to be able to access them. And we suggest that even in your team meetings, boy, if we can get somebody who's doing it right, maybe from a different division doing it right, I mean, has had a success, they want to share from another division or maybe another sales leader, bring them into your team meetings. Let's leverage those best practices as well.
And to add to that, in collaborative learning, at least in the platform we're using, we have an Ask the Expert area where we can comment, we can bring in other people to comment, to go and find the right. Part of that expertise is really the peer-to-peer learning, because quite often when people pose a question, someone else in their organization has encountered that same challenge. So we're seeing a lot of peer-to-peer learning as part of that expertise. Newer learners, more experienced learners. Melissa's mentioning about the hands-on aspect. We think that the cohort sessions are really good for hands-on learning. Those cohort sessions, depending on the geography of the participants, if it's an inside sales team, could also be run in person in a conference room as people return to work. So there are multiple ways to leverage collaborative learning. Again, I think this idea that SMEs are easier to access. So Ray, anything else you're picking up on there?
I'll just add to that, leveraging SMEs and whether it's subject matter experts or super sellers or leaders. One of the things that a platform that, as we've been talking about, allows is posting videos from others within the organization. And we found great success with these voice of the seller videos, as we're calling them. And the idea is, let's go out and interview a few of the folks that are doing things incredibly well or demonstrating those best practices. We edit those together into maybe a 3 or 4 minute little synopsis and say, well, let's talk about some negotiation tactics. What's working out there? Or let's talk about call planning and research, and why is it so important to understand those aspects before your sales meeting. And now it's not, a facilitator or a third party, but it's their own peers or their own experts within the organization, sharing those. And even the leaders, and we love to have those sponsor videos where they're kicking it off with a 2-3 minute video saying, this is why it's important, this is why we're investing in you all, and why we want you to pay attention. And I think we can do that so much easier these days, even just using Zoom or Teams to do a video interview and then do some editing, create some really great kind of just-in-time content. So let's kind of wrap this section up. We'll talk about the why collaborative learning, why we're so excited about it. We do think it improves the training experience and outcomes. And an example of that with a very large tech client that we deployed, we actually went from ILT to VILT to a collaborative experience over the course of about 6 months. Partly because we needed to scale that program rapidly, and partly because we couldn't travel anymore. So it just was no longer feasible. What's really interesting is the collaborative learning experience participants actually rated the program even higher than our ILT sessions. And the ILT sessions were some of the highest that we've had. So it was not like it was a low bar, but they thought the collaborative experience was even better. So it did improve that from an experience perspective. It allows you, some of the same things as e-learning, but to train a dispersed team, to reduce the travel costs, and really get that scalable solution. And then the other component that I think is really important is that real world application, the spaced learning, as we talked about, and the ability to learn from each other by sharing their examples and seeing the work that others are doing. So, we think all of these help create not just better satisfaction and engagement, but ultimately better outcomes in the program. So Norman, I know we wanted to share, we've talked about a few of the clients, but these are some of the quotes that we've received, and I know you've been facilitating and managing a very large client deployment. Can you talk a little bit about some of the firsthand experience you've had?
Yeah, for me, it was really an eye opener, because what it did is, I've been familiar with flipped classrooms for a period of time, where we might do micro learning and then have people kind of learn the concepts and focus the workshop on application, and over time the reinforcement on skills adoption. But this idea of launching, this was with a very, very large industrial client. So we kind of proved out that it worked in tech, but I wasn't sure it was really going to be responsive in kind of the non-technology world. And what I found is that the ease of use and the application was great. People immediately engaged. And what I would say is that the quality of work, so I facilitated a lot of live sessions. And let's say I was covering an objection handling model, and then I would call on people to to basically practice that or role play that. And they would do an okay job in the classroom, and we've kind of caught them on the fly. It's a great learning experience. But the level of thought and the quality of responses, by giving people the opportunity to really apply, and we use in our platform, we use missions, and they apply it in a mission, and then they actually submit, whether that was a price objection, too similar to my current solution, no budget. They were overcoming these objections with really well-crafted responses. Their peers were saying, they were commenting on them. Another aspect of video is throughout the program, there are opportunities for people to upload videos. When I lead the Friday cohort session, I often feature some of the videos. I call it an Internal Academy Awards, and feature some of their videos where they're actually demonstrating the skill. So I just felt that the level of skill application went way up by giving people the opportunity to think as opposed to catching them on the fly. And so the quality work was amazingly high. And then what I'm doing in the sessions I'm running, I'm actually cutting and pasting their work into the cohort session, and then letting the people who did the work comment and invite comments from their peers. So you could probably tell I'm super excited about it because I'm just seeing it firsthand. And I'm like thinking I'm on my third group with this particular client. And we got an email this morning. They budget, I think their fiscal year starts October 1. They have a bunch of other groups and other programs who want to put on this platform. So I think these participant quotes are obviously important. They give you some participant feedback. And what I'm just sharing with you is my experience facilitating one of these sessions.
Yeah, that's great. So I think some really interesting case studies and stories to share. So want to make sure we have a little bit of time for questions. So again, please feel free to chat your Q&A in if you do have questions. I'll just share, this particular example. We provided a badge, a Credly badge for completion, and that's also a little bit easier to track if we can see, hey, have they done all the assignments? Have they gotten their badges? Have they hit a threshold of points? And then they are able to qualify for a digital badge that they can share on LinkedIn and have on their signature, et cetera. And what was really interesting, our pilot group was actually over 90% completion, 93%, just fantastic for an online program. And overall, and we took over 350 sellers through that, we're receiving over 80% completion rate, which was much higher than any other program that this particular client and others had seen, of this fashion. So very pleased to see how people are leaning in. So let's cover, a couple of key takeaways, Norman, and then we'll turn it back over, see if there are any additional questions.
Right, and I'm seeing a few questions in the chat right now. So these are pretty self-explanatory, but we shared from the experience from training industry. Learners believe applied experiential practice are the best delivery methods. We saw a lot about that in terms of on-the-job training and coaching. Preferred training methods impact training effectiveness. So we also saw some research on that. Blended learning for all of us has become the new norm. Virtually everyone has shifted to some level of virtual deployment. And from our perspective, as we shared with you kind of the key theme, and we'll share some resources through training industry following, just a little bit more about the platform and a couple of blog posts that Ray and I are just kind of sharing some real world experiences on collaborative learning. So I hope we didn't push too tight against our overall time allocation here, but we'd love to take some questions. And if we don't get to your question, or you just want to ask some questions individually, feel free to contact us, info@salesreadinessgroup.com, or on our 800 number. We will absolutely get right back to you. So Elizabeth, are there some questions you want us to take, or do you want us to take the ones out of the chat? We'll defer to you.
Awesome. Yeah, of course. All right. So we do have time for maybe one or two questions here. Yeah, and this one from the chat from Charlie looks like a good one to start with. How has what clients are charged and will pay has changed as we've moved to virtual? Are budgets bigger, smaller, production costs more or less? How do you navigate all of that?
I think the budgets from my perspective have stayed about the same. I think that for the type of B2B companies that we focus on, their business actually has done remarkably well during the pandemic. What I would say is that in some cases, these types of training delivery are less expensive. There certainly aren't the facilitation travel costs that are associated with the programs. Also, for distributed teams, there aren't the travel costs and the lodging costs associated with all the participants. And just from a overall cost perspective, collaborative learning is probably a little bit less expensive than instructor-led training, but I don't think that should really be the driver. I think the driver gets back to the point we heard from negotiation as I logged in a little bit earlier from Jeff, which is it's really about the value and really crafting the program that creates the best value. But just directly responding to Charlie's questions, I have not seen a material change in budgets.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, Norman. How about this question from Janine? How do you monitor the level of engagement in a collaborative learning environment?
Sure, I could take a shot at that one. And, I think one, the platform itself allows us to do that based on the point totals and the progress week to week. We're doing a lot of reporting behind the scenes to see if people are completing the activities, and even things like engaging in a discussion, right? They can receive points for that. So we can see just how often they're participating and that engagement level. And I'll just mention there was another chat question about the platform, and I will give a shout out to Intrepid. We use Intrepid by VitalSource as our collaborative learning platform. Certainly there are other options out there, but they've been a very good partner for us, and we really appreciate some of the features they bring. And that's one of the things is we're tracking that week over week to see, are they doing the assignments, and in some cases even creating projects where they have to comment on other peers' assignments to get credit. So they're getting points for collaborating, if you will, and this idea of even sub-cohort groups or project groups that are participating. So I think they provide you a lot of nice opportunities to be able to facilitate that and encourage that.
What I would add to Ray's comment is not just the point total and the badges, because you could actually get that by almost submitting any assignment, in terms of a mission, but the transparency and the fact that everything's open to the peers and the moderator and the key sponsors, as I was mentioned before, leads to much higher quality responses. So we're seeing not just that people are engaged through completion rates and point totals, but we can actually go in and see the quality of the work they're doing. I think that, as I was sharing, the quality has been surprisingly high, and I think it's really a tribute to people's ability to think and then apply the skills that they're learning, as opposed to having to just apply kind of on the spot in a facilitated session.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so Winston is wondering, can you talk a little bit about how the peer-to-peer interactions work?
Go ahead, Ray.
Yeah, so as I just mentioned briefly, the opportunity to create a mission or an assignment and then say, okay, not only do you have to submit yours, but you have to go review and comment on, or use a rubric, if you will, to evaluate one of your peers or two of your peers. It creates that opportunity, and they learn both from being now a coach and also from seeing other assignments. So there's some great opportunities to be able to leverage that as they go along.
And what I would add to that is that even if the mission doesn't call for that, what I'm saying is that people, let's say, I'll go back to my overcoming objections, they'll write like, great response, Ray. I hadn't taken this approach before. I'm going to try that on my next. So we're finding that there's a social aspect to this where even if people aren't instructed to comment, because they can comment, or they'll put in a like, or they'll write a brief note. So the more we encourage that, the facilitator goes in and also makes comments, it starts to feed on itself that people are actually commenting on each other's work. And whether that's a formal part of the exercise or just an informal part of the platform, we're seeing a lot of peer-to-peer interaction. And that carries over to the cohort sessions, because those are being facilitated live. Typically, we do them once a week after people have done the work. And when people are sharing what they've done, they're getting a lot of questions from their peers and comments from their peers.